everyone, welcome to the February 11th edition of the TimeformUS forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and this week we're looking ahead to Saturday's late pick 5 sequence at Oaklawn Park. 11 race card. We're going to talk about races 7 through 11 that comprise that late pick 5 sequence. A couple of graded stakes on this card. The grade 3 Razorback, which I believe was originally scheduled for this weekend, and also the grade 3 Bayakoa. They had some cancellations recently at Oaklawn, so this card is pretty stacked with horses, and we've got those 2 graded stakes on tap, and they both came up as pretty competitive fields, especially that Razorback, which is the penultimate race in this sequence. So we'll get to that a little bit later, but it's a really interesting series of 5 races to talk about. A couple of maiden races in there, a very difficult allowance race right smack dab in the middle, and luckily we've got some help to talk about this sequence today, as Emily Gullikson will be returning to the podcast. Emily, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure, and maiden debut with Craig aboard today.
Yeah, Craig, I'm glad to get you both on here. I know Emily's been on a couple times when you've been either on vacation or when you had to take that leave last year, but I'm happy to have you both on because I always get positive feedback when Emily comes on the podcast, and I know that she's a voice that people like to hear.
Yeah, I've listened to her myself a few times, just recently on Jason Beam's show. I'd be lying if I said I remember what the card was, but I know I listened to the whole thing, and I was impressed, as I always am, by Emily's knowledge, and I'm glad to be able to join her this time and not be the slacker that I usually am.
Well, Emily, I think that some of the horses that we talked about the last time I had you on, I think it was the day that they ran that Tinsel Stakes. A lot of the horses are running back from a few of the stakes, so maybe we'll be able to talk about some of those things and pick up some threads that we had mentioned last time. But a lot to get through in this sequence, so we're going to dive right in. We'll kind of go back and forth with our opinions. The first leg of this sequence is race 7, a maiden special weight going 6 furlongs for the 3-year-olds and up, though not too many 3-year-olds are taking the opportunity to run in this race. I think there is just one of those. The entire field is almost all 4-year-olds. We have 10 runners signed on, and Emily, since you're the guest, I'm going to throw it to you first. This is a pretty wide open affair, and we've got some first-time starters in the mix that you kind of have to sort out, have some opinions about. Where were you looking to go here?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of an overview. This is one of the races that was canceled last weekend on February 5th. So a lot of those horses are redrawn, the 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10, with that 1 3-year-old being the 8, a first-time starter. So that horse is kind of a little bit of a toss in here. And I think just kind of looking at this race overall, kind of just starting with the horses that have experience and assessing the favorite, number 10, or morning line favorite, I should say, number 10, Strato Fortress, where certainly the most recent speed figures make sense, which is probably why sort of a default morning line favorite. But as far as this horse as an individual, I mean, we've seen what he can do. He's been a little bit below at this level in the past. So not necessarily a horse I'm looking to anchor on in this situation, kind of looking a little bit more to the lightly raced runners and some of the first-time starters.
Yeah, I agree with that. Strato Fortress seems like a good place to start in this race. He does have those 2 recent solid efforts at Oaklawn Park, and I think it's just a matter of how strong this race has come up, because it's a little hard to decipher that with those firsters in the mix. Craig, as you look through this field, I mean, obviously you've got a horse like Strato Fortress, 10th of Gold, who have the prior form, maybe a little bit less so for 10th of Gold, stepping up from the maiden claiming company. But how were you looking at this one? Were you favoring more the lightly raced horses, the first-time starters, or some of those with more experience?
I didn't particularly care for any of the first-time starters. I really wanted to make a case for him in here, but I did start with Strato Fortress just because of those speed figures Emily mentioned. They're definitely above par for a maiden race, and I have a little bit different take on him. He did kind of struggle. He ran on turf for a while, but ever since they made him a gelding and got back to dirt, he seems like a bit of a new horse. So I think he's a strong contender in here. I'm definitely going to use him pretty prominently on my tickets. That said, ignoring the first-time starters, I think after that you kind of have to take a look at the 2 Steve Asmussen horses. And of those 2, I prefer one much more than the other, and the one I don't prefer at all is 10th of Gold. He's a horse who has been out 4 times. He's not run particularly fast. He's coming off the long layoff, and obviously he's been beaten all 4 times as a maiden at short prices, but they've also come in maiden claiming races. So he started out without a whole lot of promise. without a lot of optimism, I should say. So that's just the kind I will always have trouble latching onto. The other Steve Asmussen horse, Stainless Steel, I think is much more interesting in here. He changes barns from Rudolph Brissett. He took some action a long time ago, nearly a year ago, in his first race at Gulfstream, way back in March last year. And he didn't run particularly well, but he had a bit of a tough trip. He was bumped at the start, did show some speed in a pretty quick race before backing out of it. But of the two, I much prefer him, and I'm kind of torn between him and Strato Fortress, but I'm not going to go very deep in here, so it's a case where both of those will probably be A types for me.
Yeah, Emily, what did you make of that Steve Asmussen runner, Stainless Steel? Because he seems like kind of the key to this race, depending on how he comes back. He obviously was well-meant at one point in his career, but he's pretty far removed from that debut race now.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of prefer him of the two Steve Asmussen runners for the reason that Craig mentioned. He's just, he's less exposed than 10th of Gold at this point, so there could be upside, and there's some trainer patterns to like. Asmussen just kind of overall, I mean, his most recent weekend, which is kind of tough when you have that break, but going back to January 28th through 30th, he was a little bit on the colder side, had some horses at shorter prices that kind of came up short. Nashville being one of those that probably people will remember, but there were some other short price claiming horses and maidens that just kind of failed to run to their odds. So it's just kind of something just overall that I keep in mind for this barn, because they do kind of go hot and cold. And I just think there's some value in some of these horses that, again, the first time starters that could just be a little bit under the radar. Melquette will have the pair I mentioned, Kingmaker being the 3-year-old, so less interested there. But Grapnel, this is a horse that had some setbacks. He was actually entered at this meet last year. He was on the also eligible list that was almost a year to the date on February 27th. But going back even further, worked 10-1 at the Timonium Sale, and just kind of the overall visuals I liked for this horse. This barn has been sort of the opposite. They've been sending out live as of late, so looks like a live first-time starter. Invariably is a horse that I actually kind of know a little bit because he was working at Del Mar over the summer for Cliff Seiss, and kind of a bigger type. He was scratched here on January 9th. It was an inside post, his 10-1 morning line. Strata Fortress ran on that same day, and invariably kind of seems like in terms of his workouts, I obviously we can't see them because they're here at Oaklawn Park, but just a change from those drills just in terms of time for at Del Mar. So that's a little bit interesting to me. And then Sparty Sense is one I can kind of go one way or the other. And I actually like that this race and it starts off the sequence because it allows you to see the board. Because I have noticed with the maker runners, when they do take some money, they tend to run here at Oaklawn Park. So it can be a little bit hit or miss, because as an individual, I kind of had some knocks on that debut. So it will be interesting to see how they play this horse.
Yeah, I'm glad you made those points about the first-time starters, because I think that they do have, or they might have, a major say in this race. I personally was not thrilled with the horses that have experience. Strata Fortress, I think we've covered him pretty well. He can obviously win depending on how strongly this race comes up. Stainless Steel, I really didn't know what to do with. That maiden race that he exits at Gulfstream Park from last March, I feel like it seemed stronger at the time than it is looking back in retrospect. The winner, Bears Watching, looked so promising, was a horse for Shug McGahee that just never panned out. I know some people had stakes hopes for him. It just didn't turn out that way. And he didn't show me that much in the race. I mean, the pace was honest enough, but he really had no answer through the stretch. And this is a horse that was a WinStar China Horse Club horse. They had bought him for $500,000 when he was younger. He sold recently at the November sale at Keeneland for $80,000. That's how he landed with Clark Brewster and Steve Asmussen. So I don't know. I feel like this horse, he could be the goods, or he could just turn out to be a disappointment. I'm not really sure about him, and I do feel like with Rosario taking the mount, he will attract some play in this race. I am interested in the first-time starters too. I think you make some really interesting points, Emily, about invariably the Jerry Hollendorfer horse. He does have those pretty flashy workouts on the page. The thing that scared me with him is his damn sweet Catamine. People might remember as the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies winner from the early 2000s, but she has been an absolutely awful producer. I mean, I know you don't want to get too caught up in the pedigrees with these horses that have a large body of workouts, but I mean, all of her foals have just stunk. So I'm a little bit concerned about that with this horse, but obviously it seems like the workouts say that there is some intention here for Hollendorfer. The first time starter, though, that I'm pretty interested in, that I feel like could get a little bit lost on the board, is the number 6, Life is Hard. This horse is by Munnings, who I like as a debut sire. Obviously, like all these firsters, it's taken a long time for this one to get to the races after he had that 2-year-old sales work back in April of 2020, but I liked his work that day. He looked fast working a 10-flat furlong, and his trainer, James DeVito, he's got deceptively strong stats with first-time starters, specifically in dirt sprints with firsters over the past 5 years. He's 6 for 27, 22% with an ROI that's above $4. And looking at this one's bottom side pedigree, he's actually a full brother to King Kranz, who was a good stakes type horse that was running on the New York circuit about 5 or 6 years ago. Began his career running some big speed figures in maiden races. They stepped him right up into stakes company. So I feel like this one's bred to be quick. The workouts recently, the workout times don't say a whole lot, but I don't like to get caught up in that when I haven't seen them personally. So I just think at a big price, he's one that I definitely want to include.
Yeah, he's the one first-time starter that I kind of gravitated to before I even looked at the morning line. So if I was going to use a C-type, it would be him. The others, the trainers just don't win all that much. So as the first leg of the sequence, I'm going to keep it kind of short. And if one of them knocks me out, there's always the pick 4.
Yeah, Emily, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, just I caught the work as well. I thought he just moved a little bit more like a kind of turf synthetic type horse, but I'm not going to, because I'm a little bit against some of the shorter price horses, it's kind of worth spreading. And I found Quarantine Whiskey as interesting just sort of by like, oh, kind of why not? You know, we really don't have much information on this horse. So with some knocks on the others, you know, could throw him in there just as by process of elimination. And I think another second time starter we just haven't gotten to, just because this is kind of an interesting leg to start off, is the number 9 Thunderheart, who I thought that was just such a really sneaky good, better than look debut. They really weren't asking this horse. He broke slow and just looked like there was so much more run with this individual. I mean, he's got to step up coming out of the Remington Park race. This is a tougher spot overall, but I just think there's more run, and just for an unknown type horse, barn that's probably not going to get a lot of attention, one I'm going to definitely use here as well.
Yeah, I had the same trip note about his debut. It was just a very tentative ride on that horse. I don't know how strong that race was. It probably wasn't that strong, just given a glance through the field that he was facing. But he does seem like one with upside in a race where I don't think you need that many reasons to make a case for a horse, because the favorites don't necessarily look like they are that formidable. So definitely one where you can go a lot of ways. We'll come back to this race when we do a recap at the end of the show to kind of mention who our A's or B's might be, who we're going to look to lean on in this spot, but it's definitely one that's not the easiest to get through in the first leg. Let's move on to the next race in this sequence. It's one of those graded stakes races, the Grade 3 Bayakoa for the fillies and mares, going the 2-turn mile and a 16th. And we've got a couple of horses that are coming out of prep for this race. The Pippin, Coach was the winner that day. She is one of 2 Brad Cox trainees in here. I thought that Coach got an absolutely perfect trip to win that race and did so in the slop. I looked at the Oaklawn forecast. I think she's going to encounter a fast track on Saturday, so we'll see if she can transfer that form to a dry surface, but there are other ways to go in here. Craig, I'm going to start with you. What do you make of these Brad Cox runners, some of the horses coming out of the Pippin, and who do you see as the one that you want?
It's kind of an interesting race. I think this was one I believe was actually drawn last weekend, and I can tell you it should. Your forecast is probably right, because the weather usually lags about a day from what we get here in Oklahoma City, and it's been gorgeous the last couple days in the mid 60s, so shouldn't have any weather issues there. But I was against Coach last time, and as you said, she got a perfect trip again, so she could win, I guess, but I don't particularly love her in this spot. The horse I started with was actually Queen Goddess, because she's kind of the newcomer, shipping in from the West Coast for Mike McCarthy. And she comes out of that try where she succeeded first time on the dirt in the off-the-turf American Oaks. what caught my eye, she ran a big speed figure. Now, I'll be the first to admit I'm always a little dubious of these big figures when they come in off the turf races. I pulled the card up again. It was actually run on Malibu Day. It rained. There were lots of off the turf races. So I got even a little more skeptical. But as I looked, the one dirt route that was not off the turf was the San Antonio, which was run earlier on the card that day. And it was won by Express Train. We've already seen what he came back to do. So he came back and won nicely. And her time in that race compared really favorably with the field. I don't think there's a ton of speed in here. And not that she's a horse that has to have the lead, because she's done just fine on the turf coming from a bit off the pace. So I actually think she's really a legitimate contender in here, and she's going to be my top pick.
Yeah, Emily, let's keep with that thread for a minute, Queen Goddess, because I think she's a horse that you have to sort of develop an opinion about in this race, coming off that dirt victory last time. And all the speed figures I saw had that American Oaks as very fast. Obviously, it also was allowed to keep its grade 1 status, maybe somewhat questionably by the graded stakes committee, with that race coming off the turf and no real dirt form in there. But, I mean, she is an interesting new face in here. How did you look at her, and did you want to go with her or somebody else in here?
Yeah, I mean, in this field, I really don't have any big knocks on her, because she's certainly fast enough and she has the class and she makes for a fit, just kind of, as an individual and stepping up in this spot. It was a little bit concerning to me that Hernandez didn't come in to ride, because this is, this is a good purse. It's $250,000. And I looked, because I follow Santa Anita and do the handicapping there for Brisnet, to see if there's a horse that he stayed in town to ride. And he's obviously on horses, but there's nothing that's a stakes race or anything like that. So that was just kind of one thing that I if you're kind of trying to poke holes or find any reason, just something that I noted with her. And then Craig mentioned the pace. And also mentioned that this race was redrawn. It was back on February 6th and obviously canceled that weekend. But Matera was drawn in post 6, and she draws the rail today. And I think probably that's a positive for her, because she does have some early speed and she is inside and could create a scenario where she's able to just go gate to wire.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do believe that some of these horses are just naturally faster than Queen Goddess. I know that I'm just looking at the TimeformUS pace projector, and she's shown back in 5th place. I feel like that's primarily a function of the fact that she's got all these turf races prior to that dirt race last time that are probably slowing down her early pace ratings a little bit. So maybe she'll be a bit more forwardly placed than she's shown there. But I do have some questions about Queen Goddess really turning into an actual dirt horse. She looks a little more turfy to me. I know she's got that versatile pedigree, being by Empire Maker out of a Lemon Drop Kid mare, but looking back at that American Oaks, there really was no dirt form in the race, or very little of it. And in retrospect, you can kind of say to yourself, well, whoever got out to the front end was always going to be tough that day, because that's just the way the Santa Anita surface seems to play over those 2-turn route distances. And you wouldn't expect a lot of these turf horses were going to be able to do much passing on the dirt. So I think in retrospect, the American Oaks kind of played out in a pretty logical fashion, even though she did win the race at 14-1. I'm kind of needing to see it again. I'm dismissing her a little bit in this race, and if she is around that 3-1 morning line, I'd much rather go with some other horses that will be similar prices or higher prices in this spot. I really don't have a problem with the other horse that you mentioned, Emily, Matera. Of the 2 Brad Cox horses, I do prefer her. Coach, I just kind of need to see that last out performance again. I thought she got the better trip than Miss Bigley that day. Miss Bigley just broke a little bit flat-footed, didn't get into the right position, and I thought that race arguably could have been closer if you swapped their trips. And I do think that Miss Bigley does have the tactical speed to potentially get more forward than Coach in this race. We'll see what happens with Coach breaking from the outside post this time. But I like Matera. I think the way she's coming into this race, just signals that she's a 5-year-old that might finally be coming into her own. I know that she really wasn't much at the start of her career, but a lot of these horses off a trainer switch to Brad Cox, they don't show what they've got right away. He's not a great first off the trainer switch trainer, but when he has them in his barn for a few months, they start to finally show their cards, and I think that's what's happening with Matera. Liked her effort, 2 back against a good field in the Locust Grove, and last time in the Chaluki, she ran just as well, if not better, than Miss Bigley, and I feel like she could take another step forward. horse stretching back out to the 2 turns. So she's definitely one that I'm interested in. The other horse that I liked quite a bit in this race, and if I was going to make ordinal picks, she'd be my top pick, is the number 5, Mariah's Princess. I know that she was sprinting for most of her career until the last race, but just watching her races, she feels like a horse that was kind of always meant to go longer. She's by Ghost Zapper. She's got that Ghost Zapper body frame, a horse that just seems like she wants to go a mile or a little bit further. And I liked her race stretching out last time at Oaklawn. I know it wasn't the toughest field, though. Amendment 19 and Lovely Rider were second and third. They're okay. And she put them away pretty easily, and I thought won that decisively. And it just seems like since she came back off the layoff last year for Phil Bauer, she's really upped her game to a new level, and she's getting a class test here, but she seems like the now horse that might still be a decent price in this race that I think could collect a graded stakes victory.
Yeah, you and I are going to have to make an Andy Serling-like lunch bet with Queen Goddess against Mariah's Princess, because I don't like her at all. I thought her last race was basically a cakewalk. She ran some really slow pace figures, was right there on the lead, and just didn't really have any competition that day. It hasn't come back the strongest race. That was one that even got a upgrade because the pace was so slow. We kind of upgraded it so the horses didn't look like they were claiming types. So for me, I don't like her at all in this spot personally.
I'm not against her in this spot. I'm not as excited about her as you, but I can certainly see her winning this race. Just the way that it shakes up and has the recency over this course. Just found that kind of like what Craig was saying, having that perfect trip, Queen Goddess having the lone trip, Coach having the favorable trip last out. Those just kind of being a little bit negatives where, Matera maybe could just be one of those horses that hasn't quite had those perfect trips and some subtle excuses. And then as far as Miss Bigley, another one that's like, she's certainly capable, but that really looked like the best spot for her in the Pippin. She was getting that class relief coming out of those graded stakes races where she's just a little bit below the competition. So as far as class, she's again going to have that test today at the graded stakes level where she's just going to have to kind of fall into a trip as well as run her top effort in order to win. Maybe not the most ideal distance for her either.
Let's move on to race 9, the middle leg of this pick 5 sequence. This is an allowance event for the fillies and mares going 6 furlongs on the main track, and we've got a full field signed on for this one, including a couple of also eligible entrants, one of which would be a factor in this race, at least from a tote board perspective, if she were to draw into the field, so maybe we'll touch on her at some point. But this is a really wide open affair. Emily, I'm going to throw it to you to start this one, because you've got some horses with a body of work that certainly look like they've got the speed figures to contend here. Also, some lightly raced runners that are stepping up in class. How are you viewing this race?
Yeah, it's just such a kind of a strange place to start. I guess, the way that I kind of just approach it is just in general, looking at who I think is going to be the favorite, looking at these horses that in terms of recency and of the horses that have been running here, horses that have formed at the allowance level this season. There's no real big standout like of that group. I would say probably Joyful Cadence coming out of that common race where she has a bit of a flow upgrade where she was up close to the pace and the top 2 came from off the pace. That upgrades her a little bit, but she still has some sort of overall questions for me. So I'm sort of looking outside of that group and for a new face. I think a lot of people will go towards Pharaoh's Heart, who seems to, make sense. She's been working out in California for the most part with the Mark Glatt saddle towel. Does have the recent work, but, a barn change in this case, not necessarily quite in play yet. But I guess, starting on the inside, this is sort of like my kind of wise guy smart opinion is the number 1 Super Chianti, if I'm saying that right. Kind of looked like a possible prep in terms of distance back at Churchill Downs, where I think she just needed that race. She broke slow, she was on hold, and just overall looks like a sprinter. There seems to be positive intent as well coming out of that Churchill Downs race. Her first work was over at Fairgrounds. She drilled a bullet. Then she goes right to Oaklawn Park, which there's bigger purses here, so that kind of seems like maybe they're like, oh, she's kind of the goods. And she's been working steadily. I mean, this is 5-6 days apart, solid works. She just looks very live in this spot, with some class and some speed and upside. So I'm trying to get creative in here with the number one.
Definitely seems like a spot where the race is inviting you to get creative, because the favorites do all have some question marks. I think you pointed out the right two in Joyful Cadence. I mean, she certainly makes some sense. And I do believe that the horse that you mentioned second, the number 10, Pharaoh's Heart, feels like, even though she's 5-1 in the morning line, she's the one that's most likely to go favorite in here, just based on her back class and superior speed figures and getting into the Steve Asmussen stable. I mean, the interesting thing with her is what you mentioned about the fact that she was working at Santa Anita so recently. And, I was looking up her races from last year. She was actually owned by a different group. Now she's with Little Red Feather Racing. She switched to Steve Asmussen just recently, within the past 2 weeks. I don't know when that purchase happened, if it was a long time ago, or it was very recent. It's just interesting that she's now landing on a new circuit. So she feels like one that could attract a lot of play in here. But Craig, how were you looking at this race? Were you taking that same route as Emily, is trying to find a long shot, or did these favorites?
No, I thought this race was a little bit tougher. What I started with was the pace projector, because I do think there's a lot of speed in here. It's a big field of 12 with the two AEs, and when you look through, I don't have any argument. There are quite a few horses with a lot of ones early in their pace figure lines. None of them stood out to me. Pharaoh's Heart obviously is the horse to beat for me, based on the speed figures, but I'm a little bit iffy. I mean, this just looks like a race that has prep written all over it to me. She's not really a 6 furlong type. She's coming off that long layoff. She obviously hasn't been in the Steve Asmussen barn, but it's not a strong thing for him to come off a long layoffs like this. So I kind of looked at Kaboom Baby, actually an Arkansas bred, I believe, in here, who is, she's a deep closer. But what I like about her is her speed figures fit. She's going to get the pace set up. And she's not the typical kind of plotting closer. She always seems to make her move on the turn and get it in contention at about that quarter pole. So I just think things are going to set up for her. And if I have to make a top pick, and what is a pretty deep contentious field, and one that I'm going to use a few horses, I actually do like her quite a bit, and will certainly be playing her in verticals.
Yeah, it's one of the confusing things about this race, because as I found myself going through and marking off the contenders, almost all of the contenders that I marked off are speed types that seem like they're going to get involved in another pretty quick pace, because you've got some very fast horses in here, like the recent debut winner, Wings of an Angel, and especially the number 8, I'm the Boss of Me. It feels like they really do have to be hitting on the front end. And initially, when I was looking back at that December 31st race at Oaklawn, I have the same opinion as Emily. The horse that I wanted out of there was Joyful Cadence, because she was up close to that pace, and she actually hung around pretty well, and I was kind of downgrading Kaboom Baby. But as I kind of assess the pace situation of this race, it does feel like Kaboom Baby is going to get another favorable setup. I don't think she's as naturally talented as a lot of horses in this field. She just seems... watching her run, it seems like she's taken advantage of some favorable circumstances on a few occasions, but maybe she gets the right setup once again. Emily, how are you looking at this from a pace standpoint? I know you're an analyst with OptixEQ, and this seems like the kind of race that could really benefit from using that tool to analyze it. How are you viewing who might get the right trip here and who would benefit most?
Yeah, it is an interesting pace scenario, because, you mentioned there are a lot of horses that do their best running when they're up close and on the lead. So you have that bulk of EP types, and then it certainly gets deeper with the two also eligibles. However, they're not necessarily horses that are super fast early. So you could have this contentious pace, but if it's not necessarily fast, you could have a speed of the speed scenario, especially with, a classy type speed horse, and one that's saving ground, which kind of goes to my kind of original theory in here. If they do, all kind of bunch up, and class and finishing ability does come into play, it could certainly set up Kaboom Baby, even Pharaoh's Heart, because she tends to have some tactical speed, and there's some foundation under her. Certainly distance isn't going to be a problem. we'll kind of get to 11 in a little bit too, could maybe kind of sit that same trip. But I don't necessarily see the pace as super fast and like a meltdown scenario, just kind of based on that contention and speed rate, which are kind of a little bit separate. The other thing about Kaboo Baby, which I do think that she fits off her last race, that was a very strong effort. Craig mentioned, the speed figures are right on par, but I am a little bit concerned also of a regression, because it did seem like she moved forward in that second start of the form cycle. She has kind of backed up off kind of a similar effort in the past, did have some issues at the start. Sometimes that could be a little bit of a taxing effort, but if you are kind of looking for a closer, she certainly fits. And kind of, sort of the same thing, I guess I will mention the 11, just class maybe being a little bit light and maybe was a little bit aided sort of with the profile last out.
Yeah, there are a couple other horses I want to touch upon, and I'll get each of your takes on them. And they're both speed horses, and I feel like it's interesting what you said, Emily, about there being some clearly faster horses than some others in this race. And I do believe one of them is I'm the Boss of Me, the number 8. She's a difficult one for me to assess, and I find myself taking a more favorable view of her than I originally thought I would when I started out handicapping this race. Her last effort at Oaklawn, I know it was against Claiming Company, but it was visually very impressive. She had been a Peter Miller horse. She was racing for the, I guess, former Peter Miller assistant at Oaklawn last time out. And it wasn't the strongest field in the world. She's definitely stepping up in class, but she went fast on the front end. She opened up an advantage, and she won in hand in the late stages. She's going first off the claim for trainer Greg Compton that I'm not that familiar with. I was looking up his first off the claim stats. Over the past 5 years, they look very poor, but I was just kind of sorting them chronologically, and he's had a ton of success first off the claim very recently. It seems like he's figured out how to get horses to perform first time for his barn just in the last year. So this horse seems somewhat interesting to me as one that could potentially run them off their feet. Craig or Emily, let's start with Craig. What did you think of some of these speeds like her?
Yeah, she's the one I actually like of the speeds. Even though she's coming out of a claimer, when you pull up the TimeformUS chart, it's proven to be a really strong race. A couple horses have already come back to win out of that race. The fourth place finisher, Nisi Prius, came back to win another $50,000 claimer. Another horse in there, Real Jewel, dropped a little bit in class, but down to $30K, but was also able to win. So it's not your typical $50,000 allowance race. I think it was good, and if one horse was going to get loose, I actually prefer her to Wings of an Angel, who the pace projector shows on front. I'm just always a little leery of these maiden first out winners jumping right into these maiden special or into these allowance non-winners of one when they're just going to face a lot better competition.
Yeah, Emily, what did you think of both of those horses? Wings of an Angel, the debut winner, and I'm the Boss of Me.
I think both of them are regression candidates. I'm the Boss of Me. If she ran a new top, I think that was a spot where connections were coming in and they were looking for a win. Probably figured they were gonna lose her. Now she's gonna step up in class. Optics does the Optics figure range. The Optics figure range for that claiming race was a 76 to 84. Today's is at 86 to 94. Those two horses that came back to win that Craig mentioned, one of them ran an 80 Optics figure, the other one an 83. So neither of those numbers are fast enough to win this race. And again, that was a lone trip for her. Anytime that she's had pace pressure, she's kind of folded. Her 2 wins have been when she's lone, and it just doesn't seem like she's going to get a lone trip in here. As the way that we're drawing this race up. As far as Wings of an Angel, she took pace pressure, which you like to see. The Jones runners have been kind of live this meet, so asking her to improve off that race in 36 days, taking on winners, it's a lot of challenge. And just kind of from a visual standpoint, kind of wanted to maybe see a little bit more time between starts and some regression possible. It's just kind of my read on those two.
Before we move off this race, I did mention when we kind of started discussing it, there is that one AE entrant, Ava's Grace, who has a big class line from last year when she was second in the Grade 3 Fantasy at Kentucky Oaks prep. I believe she was even entered in the Oaks and I think had to scratch that week. We haven't seen her much since then. If she draws into this race, is she a horse that either of you are interested in, or is this just one that you want to stay away from coming out of the Diodoro barn?
I want her to just stay out of this race so I don't have to answer this question if I'm being perfectly honest, just because she's just so weird. She's one of those horses that has those 2 races at Oaklawn Park that make her a player in here that you would just, she'd have to use. But there is the barn change, there is the layoff. These are connections that, it's the same ownership group, but Corville is typically a Louisiana trainer, hasn't had much success, and it's been a very, very, very limited sample as of late with horses that are running outside of Louisiana. So there's so much unknown and there's so much weird. It would just make my life easier if she doesn't run in this race. But if she does, I would just kind of have to include her off those 2 starts.
Yeah, Craig, I'm assuming you feel kind of the same way. We didn't mention her in your analysis, but she definitely is a difficult horse to assess in this race.
She is. I'll be honest, I wouldn't use her just because of the trainer change. I mean, you can only use so many. I guess she's working okay. I'm not sure where that training facility is she's been working at, but the barn change is just a little much for me. And if she does draw in, it's going to be an outside post, and she's a speed horse as well. So I would tend to not use her, but I agree. I'd prefer she doesn't draw in.
Yeah, I realize I personally did not give a strong take on this race, and I think that was kind of by design because I really have no clue. I thought that I'm the Boss of Me was interesting, but I've got the same concerns as Emily about the trip that she's going to pull. I liked Wings of an Angel's debut. I did note that she was on the wrong lead for her entire stretch run. Sometimes horses that show that little bit of greenness first time out do have a step forward in them second time, so I'm not writing off the possibility that she could move forward, but feels like she's going to pull a difficult trip here. I don't even think that the number 5, Connie K, is totally impossible. But yet again, she's a speed type who got to kind of control in the front end last time, and she's likely going to have to stalk here. Of the Arkansas breds, I think that she's the most naturally talented. I'm just not sure that the trip is coming for her. I gave a long look to that horse that Emily mentioned as a long shot, Super Chianti. I couldn't quite get there. She did have a weird trip last time. I have no idea what her overall quality is, but this seems like the right kind of race to go for a price. So I'm not going to fault it too much. There's many ways to go of this 9th race. Hopefully, if we get through this one, we can move on to race 10, the Razorback, and still have a live ticket. This, I guess, is the feature race of the day with its $600,000 purse, handicap grade 3 event for the older horses, going a mile and a 16th. And I believe this is going to be the prep race for Lone Rock, I was reading, before he ships off to the Dubai World Cup. Seems like an ambitious spot for a horse like him, but that's where they're going. So I guess based on some of that news and just his overall reputation, he's going to be one of the horses that takes money in here. Craig, how are you viewing Lone Rock in this race? Diodoro's got a couple of runners in here. Plainsman for the Brad Cox barn also seems like one that could take money. But when I look at this, it seems like a pretty wide open field. What's your view?
That's kind of what I thought at first as I was looking through. Lone Rock, he's just kind of what you younger people say, meh, something like that. I mean, he's okay, I guess, but he's nothing I'm going to get excited about, certainly at 3-1. I have no idea why they're going to Dubai with him when you could stay at Oaklawn and run for these monstrous purses and actually have a chance, because he's probably not going to have one at Maidan. But this race, I kind of was looking at it like you as I scrolled through the field. Everybody keeps running the same speed figures until I got the Plainsman, and I'm kind of stuck on Plainsman a little bit. I think his Cigar Mile was actually a really good race. When you look through the chart of that race, there were a lot of very good horses in there. Following C ran well. American Revolution, obviously, who we've talked about on our shows a lot. And even the horse that finished right behind him, Olympiad, came back with a nice allowance win. I think it was at Gulfstream Park. So for me, I think that 124 speed figure he ran that day is totally legit. He's run a 120 just 3 starts back. And I think he's going to be really tough in here. All the others are kind of mid-teens horses. And also when I look at the pace scenario, there's just not a lot of speed. We show the other Robertino Diodoro horse, Thomas Shelby, up front on the lonely lead. But I'm not enthralled with him very much. And Plainsman is tucked in right behind. So I think he's going to be really dangerous here. I'm going to have him prominently on my tickets. That said, I'm going to go a little outside the box for my top pick and go to the horse just to the outside of him, and that's Silver Prospector. He's the other horse in this field that's capable of running 120-ish type TimeformUS speed figures. He came back from a long layoff in that 5th season back in January, to a little bit short of a month ago. But I think that race is just one you can totally put a line through. There wasn't a lot of pace in the field. Unfortunately, drew wide today, on Saturday, just as he did that day, but he just got a ridiculous trip where he was just wide around both turns the whole way. Really had no chance, wasn't asked or persevered with very much, I think, once the rider realized what was happening. So I expect a much better race from him, and I'm going to use him as an A-type as well.
Well, I'll go back to kind of where the handicapping me starts with this race is the purse structure. This is a massive purse. This is a $600,000 purse. And number 5, Promise Keeper, looks like he's coming in to get the bag. Coming in off the layoff. He's been training out in Florida. Now, the race that he's eligible at Gulfstream Park, did a little bit of research on this, would be the Gulfstream Park Mile, which is that one-turn mile where he's certainly capable as far as an individual. That's a $200,000 race. Or next month in the Ghost Zapper, which is a $100,000 race. So they could stay there, fit in both those races, but they're going to come here. This is a massive purse. This horse looks good. He fits on speed figures. He has some upside being a lightly race type. I thought his race in that stakes race, the Ohio Derby, that was just such a good, gritty effort where he was inside. He was the best of the speed. That race was slowing late. It was a blanket finish. I think I saw maybe some analysis, or maybe it was the chart that said he tired late. That horse definitely didn't. He never tired. It was just kind of the race flow. It was a blanket finish. And I just think there's so much more with this horse, and coming into this spot, we've kind of seen these other horses run their races here. There's no real standout, just kind of by the way I'm kind of hearing everybody talk about it. I like this horse, just kind of maybe this horse makes sense, which I can't argue with. But I just think as far as intention with a horse that's fast enough, classy enough, coming off the layoff, picking the spot, I think this horse is in it to win it.
Yeah, there are a few 4-year-olds that are stepping up to face, I guess I can't call them their elders anymore because they're all older horses at this point, but coming out of some restricted 3-year-old races in here, and Promise Keeper does seem like one of the more interesting ones. I'm glad to hear that you have a strong take on him, Emily, because I was having a real tough time figuring out what to do with this horse. That what you say about intention, I think, is important with Todd Pletcher coming in to potentially scoop up this purse, because there are other spots that he could have run this horse in. I do feel like sometimes Todd, regardless of purse, keeps his best horses at Gulfstream at this time of year. I guess the stats don't totally bear that out because he has great numbers at Oaklawn if you just restrict it to graded stakes races over the past number of years. But I don't often feel like he sends his best out of Gulfstream. We'll see how this horse does. I was watching some of his recent workouts on XBTV, 2 of them that I could watch from Palm Beach Downs, and I don't know. I haven't loved the way this horse's last 2 workouts have played out. He's kind of gotten dropped by stablemates on the gallop outs. On January 22nd, he was working with Warstopper, who's just kind of an allowance type, and had to be pushed to keep up with that horse in the gallop out. And then his most recent work on February 5th, he was paired with Happy Saver, who I think is going over to the Saudi Cup. So, I mean, obviously Happy Saver's a good horse, but Happy Saver really left him in the dust on the gallop out, opened up like 3 lengths on him. And just visually, Promise Keeper is this horse that I always want to fall for because he's the son of Constitution. He's got that real Constitution-y stride. He's big, loping stride. He covers a lot of ground, but he's not the biggest horse. And watching those works, it felt like he just didn't grow up that much since last year. So I'm a little concerned about what we're going to get from him, although I agree with all the points you made about his races from last year. I liked his Ohio Derby a lot. I just kind of have mixed feelings about him. I'm not sure what I want to do with him. For me, it would be heavily dependent on price. Obviously, with this race being the 4th leg of the Pick 5 sequence, you don't get to see what the win odds are going to be. But I wonder if he's going to take some play in here. We'll see how that all plays out. As for the 2 horses that are pegged at the shortest prices on the morning line, I'm taking a negative view of Lone Rock. I thought he got a good trip last time. Going the mile and an eighth, I think it's asking a lot of him to make this horse turn back to a mile and a 16th. I know it's just a half a furlong shorter, but it's really less distance is not what this horse wants. And I think that they're maybe viewing him as a little higher quality than he really is, going these conventional round distances if they're targeting a race like over in Dubai. So I'm looking for Lone Rock to get a little bit exposed here. I was somewhat against against him. Craig mentioned Plainsman as being way the horse to beat, and I don't totally agree. I feel like maybe Plainsman is slightly better in one-turn races. I often don't like to make a whole lot of that stuff, but just based on his results, it feels like he's really stepped up to the plate and hit it out of the park in those one-turn races as opposed to the two-turn races. Maybe that's just the opportunities that Brad Cox has given him. He is obviously in good form recently. I thought people might make too much of that comment line last time when he was steadied in the stretch of the Cigar Mile. Really, that didn't cost him anything. I mean, maybe a half a length of position. He was never going to beat the top two that day. But he does have the speed figures coming in here. I think he makes a certain amount of sense. I like that Craig brought up Silver Prospector. We had talked about him a little bit, I know, Craig, on the Pacecast after that fifth season was run, and we had both noted that from a trip standpoint, he might be the horse that you wanted out of the fifth season last time. I agree. He's got a wide post again. I'm not getting too concerned about that. But as I look at the fifth season and the way it played out and this race, I kind of feel like maybe Thomas Shelby is the right horse. And I don't know if Thomas Shelby is necessarily the most naturally talented horse in this field, but the last two times that he's run, he has not been able to make the lead. There have been some horses that have just been more aggressively ridden than he was. Kind of a surprising lead or two back when Huge Bigley was kind of whipped out of the starting gate in the Tinsel. And then last time you had Concert Tour and another horse stretching out in distance, Mucho, who were just naturally faster than Thomas Shelby. And that was a weird race, the fifth season, where those horses were aggressively ridden to get to the front on the first turn, and then they really backed down the pace immediately after that. I think it took some of the horses in the back out of their game. Rated R Superstar moved up at the perfect time, and I thought got a great trip that day. But I thought Thomas Shelby, that's just not the situation when he had been most successful in the past. And he's going to be controlling up front this time. I don't see anybody in behind him sort of being taken out of their best game to go after him. So I'm always afraid of these Diodoro horses in these route races at Oaklawn. And I feel like Thomas Shelby, finally, after taking some money his recent races, the bettors are going to go off him a little bit off those two recent losses. And I feel like he's a very dangerous gate-to-wire threat here.
Yeah, I agree that he, just in terms of tactics from the other riders and from Thomas Shelby, where he, in races that he needed to make the lead, was unable to do so. And that's where he has his best game. And he should be allowed that scenario here. And they should ride him, David Cohen, being a little bit more aggressive today. And then he's just got to prove it at this class level, because he's been able to do it against slightly softer. And again, this is, a graded stakes level. And just in terms of the pace, as I think Craig mentioned this, that there isn't a lot of pace in here. So he should have that opportunity, but then that also could help, a horse that's just going to sit kind of right behind him, which maybe that's the trip, Promise Keeper. And if they're not aggressive with Thomas Shelby, then, Drew, who can certainly be aggressive on the front end, could take that role as well.
Yeah, looking at the pace projector, and I was just going to going by memory because we don't have access to older pace projectors. Maybe someday we can get that put in the chart. I've been working on that. But he's a horse who's been projected to lead a few times and hasn't been able to do it. Like you said, there were some extenuating circumstances, but I wonder about a horse like Promise Keeper, if he's going to push him and maybe try to take the lead from him. He's run fine on the lead. So that was my one downside. He's had this scenario before and it just hasn't worked out. So he's one I would use more as a C-type. If he does get that early lead, I think he'll be really dangerous. I just wonder if it's going to be as easy as it looks on paper.
Yeah, the one other horse I was trying to make a case for was the 7 Last Samurai. Emily, I think you liked him as well last time. I know Craig was off that day, but we did that race on the...
I liked him, yes, on the day that he won, correct.
Yeah, the poinsettia. Yeah. He was a nice price that day, going off at just over 4-1. He's got to have to step up if he's going to beat this field, and I feel like he might be a last time was the time sort of horse, especially given the way the pace is likely to play out here. But he is an improving newly turned 4-year-old that I don't want to completely dismiss, because I feel like he's heading in the right direction right now. And this does seem like a race where a lot of these favorites have kind of reached their plateau, and some of them might even be slightly on the downswing. So, I mean, I don't want to completely dismiss an improving horse like Last Samurai. It would just be a matter of price for him, because he'd have to get much higher than he was last time.
Yeah, I think for all those reasons, I could make a case to use him. Just sort of the other horses we've seen where they're at, and this one could just have that move forward. They had intention with him, put him a little bit more ambitiously placed when he was not quite ready for the graded stakes level here last year, and maybe could just be coming into his own. And that was a strong effort. Just I give it a B plus optics grade, which does tend to suggest a horse can step up in class. This is certainly that step up in class, though. Big step.
Let's close things out with race 11. It's another maiden event, this one going the 2-turn mile at Oaklawn for the 3-year-olds, and got a lot of lightly raced runners in this race, particularly second-time starters who are stretching out in distance. So let me start with, I think, Emily on this one. There are a couple of Brad Cox trainees. We've got Steve Asmussen stretching out in distance, a couple of Rodolphe Brissett runners, one of which is a first-time starter. Where were you looking to begin in this race?
Well, let's start there with the Brissett runners. So I mentioned earlier the redrawn races. We the People was entered one of those races. Actually entered on Sunday as well. Both those races were sprints, so I'm not sure where he's at. Going to debut around 2 turns. Maybe that wasn't the most ideal. This spot wasn't the most ideal for him. Maybe they didn't want to sprint, but just the way that it came up, they're going to take this spot now. And certainly at 7-2, that is just like not that exciting to me. The number 9 Kuchar, I mean, this horse he stands out to me. I mean, I thought his debut was sneaky good for a horse that looks like he wants more ground. The spot, looks picked out for him. Again, a lot of these horses had been in other places coming into this race, just sort of different paths, where this one's coming off a layoff. It's a second start, looks very live of the two. It's a very enticing price. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the case. But of those two, that's kind of the A, that's a key horse in that sequence. And we'll go to the two Brad Cox runners. Number 2, Deputy Connect, is listed as the morning line favorite and probably going to be with that speed figure and kind of with the connections, but was a little bit flow aided in that sprint. Just kind of overall needed to see a little bit more from him. Got that strong gallop out, but again, that was also kind of just part of the race shape. Stablemate number 10, I'm looking at the wrong notes here. Was another one that was a little bit flow aided in debut for the minors. Giroux is on the 4, so I don't know. People kind of reading into that. The January 2nd race that horse comes out of hasn't been a strong race, so that was a little bit concerning. I guess that kind of pairs up. Maybe I went a little bit too long of your questions in there, but I guess that's kind of a good place to start. I don't know if I hit all that or I went a little bit too far.
No, that's great. I mean, those are the horses coming from the powerful stables, and I think they're where you have to begin in this race. I had the same notes as you on the Brissett runners. I was a little perplexed as to Giroux being on the first-time starter, because I think that what you said, Kuchar, that debut, I know it was a long time ago at Ellis, but everything about that race said to me, this horse wants 2 turns. I mean, he's supposed to stretch out in distance. He wasn't facing a strong field that day. That really hasn't come back as the highest quality maiden event, but it just feels like the kind of horse that was not meant to do well in the summer of his 2-year-old season. He's supposed to be get the chance to do what he really wants right now, stretching out to the 2 turns now that he's a 3-year-old. So I think he's very interesting. Just a little odd to me that the less live jockey is on him, but perhaps that's just going to help the price. So from a wagering standpoint, maybe that's not a bad thing. Craig, how are you viewing these horses, especially those 2 Brad Cox runners, and where were you looking to go in here?
Well, I've went pretty narrow in the other races, so I'm spreading a little wider in here, and I'm just going to cast a big net over the second-time starters. I don't have too much to add, but it's not just that they're second-time starters. All of them in TimeformUS come from trainers that don't do that great first time out in Brad Cox, Steve Asmussen, Rodolphe Brissett, but they all improve greatly in the second start, so I'm not going to get too clever trying to figure out which one. I like Kuchar for all the reasons you guys have mentioned. I think Frisco Line is a horse who I think could run just fine in here. Deputy Connect is another one. And even Uncle Burley for Steve Asmussen. He didn't do much running first time out, but just strictly as a trainer move, I think he has some upside. And All the other horses just don't do much for me. We the People, as I mentioned, Brissett, he's not the greatest first time out. He generally gives his horses a start, so I don't want any parts of that at a short price. As Emily mentioned, he was entered in a sprint first out. Feels like maybe this was just kind of plan B. So for me, I'm going to use those 4 second time starters from the bigger barns.
Yeah, I want to add just, something on some of those second time starters. As far as the three, he was actually facing older in that debut race, so this is kind of a bit of a class change and typically a positive one, running against 3-year-olds, and then also 11, another second-time starter. That's a strong race as well that he's coming out of. It's a stronger race, just in terms of race par than the January 2nd race as well.
Yeah, good point about the. Which one was it? The 10, the one that was, Uncle Burley, who was facing older, because we've actually already talked about Strato Fortress, and I had said Strato Fortress, and I had said that he was a horse that was running above par, and that was for older. So it's certainly a pretty big drop in class.
Yeah, I think you guys make really good points about all the second-time starters, and I completely agree about that firster for Brissett. Over the past 5 years, he's 0 for 12 debuting horses in dirt routes, so I don't really want that horse if he's going to take money with Giroux riding. And I agree with what Emily was saying about the 2 Deputy Connect. I feel like he's going to take money in this race. Of the horses stretching out, just kind of looking at them physically and just the way they ran in their debuts, even though he had that big closing run, I'm almost the least convinced about him stretching out, especially given the fact that he had such trouble getting out of the gate and getting into stride last time. You don't want him to be so outrun going this 2-turn mile distance when I don't see that much speed signed on. Maybe some of the second-time starters will show more speed on the stretch out, but I prefer that other Brad Cox runner Frisco line. Don't love the race he's coming out of, but we've seen these run happies do very well on the stretch out. He actually has excellent stats with his dirt route progeny, so I think Frisco line could appreciate more distance. And that Lucas runner on the outside, Papa Rocket, I think he is a major player in this race. Emily and Craig both pointed out the strength of that race. Favorite Outlaw came back to win with a huge speed figure next time. I think the 5th place finisher also came back to run faster. And Papa Rocket, I mean, he wasn't really competitive with the top 3 that day. He faded a bit at the end, but just ran like a horse that I think will be more forwardly placed, stretching out in distance. They're going to have to use him from this outside post. And he's got some stamina breeding on the bottom side, even though he's buying into mischief. So I think he's a horse that definitely could take a step forward in this spot. And coming out of the Lucas stable, he's probably going to be a decent price in here because often the Brad Cox runners take the majority of the play in these maiden events at Oaklawn.
Yeah, and Wayne Lucas is, although his stats aren't what they used to be, even in TimeformUS, first time out he gets a rating of 4 on a scale of 1 to 100, jumps up to a 52 with second time starters, and for people as old as me will remember, that was his MO for a long time. He didn't win very much first time out, and his horses just improved a bunch when he was the top trainer in the game. So Papa Rocket wouldn't surprise me in the least.
Well, there was a lot to talk about in this sequence, and we spent a lot of time covering it, so hopefully we gave out some good insights. Before we just wrap it up, Emily, just give a brief review of if you were going to play this Pick 5 sequence, how you'd be looking to approach it from a ticket construction standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I've already kind of started that process, and writing a ticket, I am going to put a lot of pressure on myself that I don't mess that up because I have kind of 3 key horses at pretty square prices to close out the sequence with that Super Chianti on the rail and the allowance, Promise Keeper in the Razorback, and then the 9 in this race that we talked about. So those 3 horses are kind of major keys. I mean, if all 3 of them win and I don't hit this, I've really screwed up somewhere along the way, and I'm not going to do that. But those are sort of my keys in the sequence. As far as the first 2 races, where I don't have as strong opinions. I mean, I prefer the Terra of that group, but going to use a few others. And then that maiden race that I know we spent a lot of time on, but I think that was important that we did because it just shows how wide open it is, how strong you want to go, especially if you're trying to, beat the favorite in the first leg, because that is kind of the horse that I think even if people don't like that horse, we hear this all the time, one that people are going to use defensively. So a lot of action will be on that horse. So that's just sort of the way I'm going to approach it. I have those keys on the end, and it's really just going to come down to writing good tickets and not messing it up.
Craig, how about you?
For me, I went kind of short in a lot of the races. I actually like that the 10 horse in the first, Strato Fortress, because of his above par figure, and I like the other Rasmussen and Stainless Steel. The Bayakoa, I'm going to lean pretty heavily on Queen of Goddess. We have our lunch bet there because I'm not going to use your horse, Mariah's. I forget her name now, Mariah something or other.
Mariah's Princess,
yeah. But I will use a few others in there. Miss Bigley, Matera, Coach. I think they all could win in here, so I don't want to get knocked out if one of them wins, but not to the level that I'm going to use Queen of Goddess. I'm definitely going to spread a bit in race 9. I will use Pharaoh's Heart as an A, I think, or Kaboom Baby, I apologize. I think it's going to set up for that one pretty well. He's got that closing running style that I like in these spots. But I'll use some others like Pharaoh's Heart, the 8 horse who you mentioned on the lead, and probably even go a couple deeper. I'm only going to go 2 deep in the Razorback using Silver Prospector and Plainsman. And then the last race, I'm just going to cast a wide net with those 5 second-time starters.
Yeah, if I play this one, it's going to be hard not to go lean more on the expensive side because I feel like my opinions are a little all over the place in this sequence. In the first leg, I would try to narrow it down a little bit. I am most afraid of the first-time starters. I would use the 2 invariably, and I like that number 6 at a price. If he is a price, we'll see before we play the sequence. The number 6, Life is Hard. There are the 2 that I would lean most heavily on. In the 8th race, I would lean mostly on Mariah's Princess, that horse that I was giving a positive review to, and also the number 1, Matera, one of the 2 Brad Cox runners. I would try to get through the race with mostly those 2. I would spread as much as possible in the 9th race. I would kind of listen back to what both Emily and Craig said and try to cherry pick some of their opinions because I really did not have a strong take on that race. I would use horses like the 2, the 4, the 8, the 10. I'd even throw in Emily's long shot, Super Chianti, who I think she made a good pitch for. And the 10th race, I'm going to lean on Thomas Shelby a little bit. I would use a little bit of Last Samurai as well. And even Promise Keeper, I could throw it underneath, as well as Craig's long shot, Silver Prospector, but they'd be more C types for me in an ABC kind of wager because I have some questions about them. And then the last race, it's the second-time starters, and the ones that interested me most were the 9, Kushar, and the 11, Papa Rocket. Well, hopefully we gave out some good opinions on this sequence. I know we all were a little all over the place, but it is that kind of set of races, and it does feel like if this one comes in, it's going to pay pretty well. Craig, I know that we've said that about a few sequences recently, one of which at Oaklawn ended up coming back pretty chalky, but I'd be a little bit surprised if this one does.
Yeah, I would as well. The big field sizes at Oaklawn usually lend to a little bit better payouts. You never know. This isn't one of those big stakes cards. Like, I was really glad we didn't do Tampa because when I looked at those races, it just looked outside of the Davis, which was a tough race for me. The other stakes looked really chalky, but I don't think we're going to get that here at Oaklawn on Saturday.
Well, Emily, I want to thank you for coming back on the podcast. Great insights as always, and hopefully we have you back soon.
Yeah, anytime. It was great to talk with you guys. You guys are great handicappers. I respect. So I know I'm coming on this show. I really have to prepare and bring my A game in. I appreciate that from just kind of a creative outlet.
Well, you always do for sure. I know the listeners appreciate it. So thanks for coming on, Craig. Great job as always. We'll be back on Tuesday with Craig to talk about these races, recap some of the graded stakes from Oaklawn on the TimeformUS Pacecast. Remember that you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS Pacecast coming up next Tuesday.